For those unaware, an Iceberg video is a really long video in which I infodump a bunch of facts that I know about my favorite band of all time, Genesis. If you're a longtime fan of the band, it's good to see you here. If you're just getting into the band, welcome. Whether you're a decades-long fanatic or just starting your journey into progressive rock, you'll undoubtedly enjoy this video. As for me, I don't know what I could possibly say to introduce to you my favorite band of all time, except to endlessly drone about everything I know about them. This is an iceberg that I created myself with a little help from some of my friends. Although, for me, Genesis is a band that needs no introduction. So, sit back, grab a snack, grab your favorite drink, let's dive into the Genesis Iceberg. Phil Collins. Philip David Charles Collins, born on January 30th, 1951 in London, England, has been the primary drummer and percussionist for Genesis since 1971, as well as their lead vocalist starting in 1976. He is mostly well known for his countless radio hits from his solo albums in the 80s, and is credited for giving 80s pop its signature sound. Even your mom knows who Phil Collins is. His most notable albums include Face Value and No Jacket Required. The former album featuring probably his most well-known tune, In the Air Tonight. The pop hits. Speaking of hits, a number of Genesis tunes from the 80s have made their way onto the radio and are even played still to this day. Some of these songs that are still popular today include Invisible Touch, Mama, We Can't Dance, Turn It On Again, and No Reply at All. Tune into any classic rock or 80s radio station, and you'll probably hear a number of these songs being played at any time. Peter Gabriel. Peter Brian Gabriel, born on February 15, 1950, in Surrey, England, was a founding member of the band in 1967, while the members of Genesis were still attending school. He served as lead vocalist from their debut album to their 1974 album, The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. In the mainstream, he's more well known for his pop hits. These include Sledgehammer, Games Without Frontiers, and In Your Eyes. One of his most popular albums is called So, that was released in 1985. Tarzan. The 1999 Disney-produced animated movie Tarzan features a soundtrack with songs composed by Phil Collins. These include Son of Man, Strangers Like Me, and You'll Be in My Heart. Songs that are relatively well known and serve as nostalgic callbacks for many people who watched the movie as children. The soundtrack itself has particularly a few memes made about it on the internet. Tony Banks. Anthony George Banks, born March 27, 1950 in East Hoathly and Holland, England, has been Genesis's keyboardist since its inception and has been a member throughout Genesis's entire history. He also provides acoustic guitar in some ballads, as well as some backup vocals during a couple songs. Tony has seen little exposure from his solo ventures in the 80s, but has provided the band with a distinctive synthesizer sound since the 1970s. Mike Rutherford. Michael John Clutie Crawford Rutherford, born on October 2, 1950 in Surrey, England, has been Genesis's primary guitarist and bassist throughout its entire history, and, like Tony Banks, has been a member of Genesis since its inception. Mike can switch between playing lead guitar, rhythm guitar, and bass, and will usually switch up his role during live performances. He primarily serves as lead guitarist and bassist on Genesis studio albums. He has found very little success as a solo artist, but he was involved in a mildly popular band in the 80s, and that band was called Mike and the Mechanics. Mike and the Mechanics is Mike Rutherford's offshoot band from Genesis, with different members. These include Paul Carrick from Ace and Roachford. The group saw a couple hits from their few album releases, such as The Living Years and All I Need Is a Miracle. The Stadium Tours. During the 80s and into the early 90s, Genesis would regularly play and sell out sports stadiums. Many of their tours revolve around these large spaces, and a few professionally shot tour videos have been released alongside their respective concert live albums. These include Three Sides Live from 1982, and the Invisible Touch Tour in 86 and 87. which included the promotional music video collection aptly titled Visible Touch. These tours signify the height of their popularity, and even during their last tour in America and Europe, they were able to sell out stadiums multiple nights, playing their last show in March of 2022 at the O2 in London, England. The Progressive Era. While most people are aware of Genesis as a pop band known for the catchy hits in the 80s, many people are not as familiar with their repertoire of work from the 70s. Many people might not even know Peter Gabriel was even a member. Starting in the early 70s, the band started experimenting with their sound, utilizing newer instruments and electronic synthesizers. With this newfound success after touring through Italy, the band was picked up by Charisma Records and released Nursery Crime in 1971. The next year saw their progressive sound furthered with Foxtrot in 1972. The songs were becoming longer and more complex. Side B of Foxtrot is composed mostly of a side-long, 22-minute long epic called Supper's Ready. The band furthered their sound the following year with the release of Selling England by the Pound, to critical acclaim. This album contains some of the most legendary tracks, including Firth of Fifth, I Know What I Like, The Cinema Show, and Dancing with the Moonlit Night. Fans consider Selling England one of their definitive LPs and a must-listen for any new fan. With this, the band decided to take things up a notch by releasing their first double LP concept album, The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, in 1974. The album and tour marked the beginning of the end with the band's frontrunner, Peter Gabriel, who took a physical and emotional toll from performing live. The late 70s saw their sound evolve from progressive rock to radio-friendly pop tunes, with some heavier prog moments intertwined into their albums, but more on that later. Steve Hackett. Stephen Richard Hackett, born February 12, 1950, in London, England, was the former lead guitarist of Genesis during their classic progressive period in the early 70s. Steve served as their lead guitarist, while Mike Rutherford was relegated to mostly bass and rhythm guitar on studio LPs and live shows. Steve also showed a massive talent as a lead guitarist and provided grand sweeping solos to a large chunk of early Genesis hits around this time. Many fans of the band point to Steve as their greatest guitarist despite only being in the band for 6 short years. And speaking of guitarists, Anthony Phillips. Anthony Phillips, born December 23, 1951, in Chiswick, England, was a founding member of Genesis alongside Peter, Tony, and Mike in 1967. Ant provided lead guitar for the band during their formation and helped write many songs along with the band's primary songwriting duo Mike and Tony. Anthony's guitar playing style is more pastoral and romantic compared to Steve's classical and hard rock style. Anthony appears on their first 2 albums but left the band in 1970 due to anxieties performing in front of an audience. Despite leaving early, Ant maintained a close relationship with the band and even had Phil Collins sing lead vocals on his first solo album, The Geese and the Ghost, in 1977. His songwriting in these formative stages helped give the remaining members an inspiration for where to take their sound further in the early 70s. From Genesis to Revelation. The band released their first album in 1969. The band molded their sound to help better fit with their first label, London Records. They more or less wanted attention from record shops and radio DJs to play their material. The band went in a decidedly pop style, akin to the Bee Gees around this time, and created a concept album revolving around books from the Bible, retelling the entire story in under 45 minutes. A concept that Peter Gabriel laments was a bit silly at the time. Because of this, record shop owners thought the album with its intense black cover wasn't a pop album but instead a religious album, and most stores opted to place the album in the religious section, away from the ears of potential listeners of pop and rock music at the time. Trespass. Trespass was released in 1970 and is arguably their first progressive rock album. The last album to feature Anthony Phillips and the first and last to feature the one-off drummer John Mayhew. The album explores deeper themes and concepts in the lyrics, and the music is complex and amped up to more fuzzed out levels. There is more creative experimentation found on this LP and provides listeners with a deep, oral experience than their previous work. The LP ends with The Knife, a vicious proto-metal rock song that chugs with a driving beat. The lyrics are darker and tell a story about the horrors of war and civil disobedience. The LP itself is more mature and speaks to a more creative side of Genesis that will be more evident as the 70s trudge on. Ironically, The Knife was the song Phil Collins performed while auditioning for the role of drummer in the band, to which he blew away the rest of the band during his performance. Peter Gabriel's departure. The tour the band took while releasing The Lamb had taken a tremendous toll on Peter Gabriel at the time. The show itself was plagued with many issues from the start, and the technology used in the show, such as the lighting effects, projectors, costume changes, sets, and effects, combined with problems arising from his newly born baby daughter, who was having health complications, it was becoming increasingly difficult to keep up the energy needed to be frontman of a rock band. Peter announced he was leaving privately to the band during the 1974 and 75 Lamb tour, but promised to fulfill his duties on tour and complete each set. It's unfortunate because on some bootleg recordings of live shows made around this time, you can hear Peter's energy is not where it usually is, especially from shows played in late 1974, compared to shows played in 75. Peter would release his first solo album a few years later in 1977, called Peter Gabriel, a trend that would continue for the next 3 albums that he made. Charterhouse. Charterhouse is the preparatory school attended by Tony Banks, Mike Rutherford, Anthony Phillips, and Peter Gabriel in the early 60s. The boys met there while in 2 separate bands, which then combined to create what would become Genesis. The school is well known amongst fans of the band for being the formative place where the band got started, and is a place mentioned semi-frequently by Tony and Mike in interviews. Genesis Live Supper's Ready Mix. Initially slated to be a double LP containing 2 discs, Genesis's first official live album was released with only 1 disc, and contained a majority of tunes performed by the band's latest 2 albums, Foxtrot and Nursery Crime. However, notably absent from the tracklist is the band's seminal live performance of Supper's Ready. Allegedly scrapped at the last minute due to budget constraints, there is a mix made for an album release of the live performance of Supper's Ready, which can be listened to on YouTube if you know where to look. Despite being a very, I would say, average performance of the song, the omission of the track off the first live album would be seen as a misstep by fans, as it would take another 4 years for the song to receive a special live album treatment on their 1977 live LP, Seconds Out. Duke Suite. Speaking of 20-minute epics, the progressive rock genre is well known for bands pushing the limits of how much music they can cram onto one vinyl record, regularly leading to bands in this genre having songs that go well beyond 20 minutes. Another contemporary band at the time called Utopia were going well beyond that, making a side-long track that's almost 30 minutes long on the album called Todd Rundgren's Utopia. It's an album that was released in 1974. Genesis, in 1980, wanted to create another long suite of music from their new album, Duke. Inspired more by pop music around this time, the Duke Suite would feature tracks that were already on the album as we know it, but in a different order, and were more coherent transitions between songs. These tracks include Behind the Lines, Duchess, Guide Vocal, Turn It On Again, and finishing with Duke's Travels. Altogether, the suite would be pushing 30 minutes, and due to the nature of producing records, would be noticeably apparent on each pressing, as the more music you put on one side of a record, the quieter it needs to be to fit in. The band settled on splitting up the tracks on the LP, making it fit better on each of the 2 sides. The album itself, Duke, is around 55 minutes long, which goes well above the average record length of around 45 minutes. Usually, a record is produced at around 45 minutes to get the recommended highest fidelity to its consumers. B-sides. A trend most popularly associated today with the Beatles, Genesis has officially released several tracks that do not have an appearance on any studio LP, but rather show up as a B-side on a 7-inch 45 single. Some elusive songs include Twilight Alehouse, The Day the Light Went Out, and Vancouver. The latter 2 tracks were pressed as B-sides to the singles from the studio LP, and then there were 3. and narrowly escaped being featured on the album. Some tracks from Duke and Abacab sessions, such as Open Door, You Might Recall, Paperlate, and Evidence of Autumn, were also loosely released on B-side singles. However, on the US original pressing of Three Sides Live, their third live album, these B-side tracks make their way onto the double LP, encompassing the fourth side studio. Peter Gabriel's costumes. A hallmark of Genesis live shows in the early 70s was Peter Gabriel's elaborate stage theatrics and costumes he would don during performances. Some costumes were worn specifically for a particular song or even one section of a song. Most notable costumes include his Old Man costume, which he would put on a party store mask for the finale of the musical box, the Magog, a geometric demon used for the Apocalypse and 9/8 section of Supper's Ready, Rael, a Puerto Rican punk rocker from New York City, who serves as the main character of The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, the Slipper Man, a bulbous humanoid creature meant to represent a sexually transmitted disease which Rael metamorphosizes into near the end of The Lamb, and Britannia, the representation of Great Britain, who gives a speech before performances of Dancing with the Moonlit Night. There are several other examples of costumes used for shows by Peter, and even Phil attempted a couple to carry on the tradition, but he would only do so sporadically. Genesis reunions. Starting when Peter Gabriel left the band in 1975 and Steve's departure in 1977, there has been much speculation on the part of fans of a possible reunion show. However, there was one significant reunion tour in 1982, for a charity concert event popularly dubbed Six of the Best, as the show was technically not billed as a Genesis concert. However, this show became the unofficial reunion of the original band minus Hackett. Peter Gabriel joined the rest of the touring band at a time which included Chester Thompson and Daryl Sturmer, adding in Mike, Tony, and Phil to become the Six. Besides that, there was a prolific reunion tour in 2007, about 10 years after Calling All Stations' album release and Phil's hiatus from the band. The recent farewell tours in 2021 and 2022 represented the last time Genesis toured as a band, and not as a reunion show. MIDIon. As prog rock began falling out of favor towards the late 70s, some bands continued to carry on the genre into the 80s with neo-prog, a genre that takes inspiration from bands of the early 70s like Yes, King Crimson, and Genesis, but putting a new modern flair to it with new wave tendencies. One band that garnered much attention in the genre was MIDIon, formed in England with lead vocalist Fish at the front. MIDIon gained popularity from their first few albums, Script for a Jester's Tear and Fugazi, which included a Billboard hit in the UK, Kaylee. They had been compared to Genesis if they had continued their pastoral progressive sound into the 80s, which the original band was criticized for not doing, rather than venturing into pop music at the time. Any Genesis fan should give MIDIon a listen, even to the albums made after Fish left the band. Shortcut to Somewhere. Fish has been compared largely to Peter Gabriel, as their vocal delivery is strikingly similar. That said, in 1986, Tony Banks collaborated with Fish to create a one-off song called Shortcut to Somewhere, a blending of both old and new, as Tony brings flashy pop synths to Fish's reserved progressive vocals. It also led to this humorous photo being taken of the two wearing shirts from each other's albums. I think that's fun. You should give it a listen. Private Parts and Pieces. Aside from Anthony Phillips' main solo albums in the late 70s, including Geese and Ghost, Wise After the Event, and Sides, Anthony also released a compilation of demo songs and compositions under the moniker Private Parts and Pieces, which was also released under the label Mike Rutherford released his solo albums on. They include instrumental guitar pieces which border on classical performance. When listening to these albums, it's easy to hear much of the influence of early Genesis days and how much that sound was used by the remaining members of the band on their prog albums. Steve Hackett's exit. Near the end of the Wind and Wuthering tour in 1977, Steve made his departure from the band after several years of feelings of being ignored and generally left out of the songwriting process in the band. Up to that point, he had a solo album out and planned several songs that he hoped to show the band, which were usually discarded for songs composed by Mike or Tony. There's an interesting anecdote from Phil that he recalls seeing Steve on the day he announced leaving the band. He noticed Steve walking down the street towards the studio where Tony Banks was mixing the live album Seconds Out. Phil called to him from his car and told him to get out for a ride down to the studio, to which Steve refused. Ultimately, Steve recalls in interviews that he knew that if he got into that car and talked with Phil about leaving, Phil would have talked him out of it. Ultimately, Steve announced his departure from the band, and there would only be 3 members of Genesis left, leaving them to spend the next year working on new material as a trio. Chester Thompson. Chester Cortez Thompson, born December 11, 1948 in Baltimore, Maryland, was Genesis's resident touring drummer from 1977 to 2007. During live performances, since Phil Collins found himself at the front of the stage more than behind the drum kit, Genesis were perspective in finding a new live drummer for shows while Phil sang lead vocals. In 1976, he saw Yes and King Crimson alum Dr. William Bruford, aka Bill Bruford, assume the role. According to Bill, it was one of the most carefully rehearsed bands that he ever performed with, which would be a stark contrast coming from the highly improvisational nature of King Crimson from years previous. For the next tour, Genesis would pick up ex-Mothers of Invention drummer from Frank Zappa's band, Chester Thompson. With his background in jazz drumming and from playing with Frank himself, Chester was well versed in complex music arrangement and took to their music pretty easily. Chester became their resident touring drummer for decades and even performed on their 2007 reunion tour, as well as touring with Phil Collins on his solo tours. Chester makes his first appearance on Seconds Out and has remained on their live album since, besides the recent 2021 and 2022 farewell tour. Daryl Stuermer. Daryl Mark Stuermer, born November 27, 1952 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, was Genesis's lead resident touring guitarist after the departure of Steve Hackett. Daryl joined the band's live lineup with Chester for their 1978 tour. Being that the band was now essentially a trio, another guitarist was necessary to assist Mike with rhythm sections and bass parts when necessary. Coming from Jean-Luc Ponty's band, Daryl also possessed skill and playing chops within jazz and fusion, which aided him in learning the new parts for the live shows. He's been featured on every live album since Three Sides Live, and was even present for Genesis's final farewell tour. The Anon, Pennsylvania Flick House. Back at Charterhouse during the 60s, the two bands formed were called Over the Garden Wall and the Anon, with Peter and Tony in the Garden Wall, and Mike and Anthony in the Anon. There exists one demo tape of the Anon performing a song called Pennsylvania Flick House, a recording dating to at least 1966. Interestingly enough, this is the first time fans would ever hear the band that would eventually become Genesis a few years later. Steve Hackett mixed out of Seconds Out. Although perhaps not an entirely true story, there are fan accounts of Tony, upon hearing that Steve was leaving the band, began mixing out Steve's guitar parts lower and lower into the mix to where he's just barely audible on the album. This allegedly can also be further corroborated by listening to bootlegs recorded around the same time on this tour. For example, the bootleg Live in Zurich 1977, where Steve can be heard way more clearly in this mix than on the mix for Seconds Out. Although it's an ironic story, I'm not convinced it's true, considering the entire mix for Seconds Out is, in my opinion, very flat to begin with. Nothing pops out in the recording, unlike on the audience recordings and soundboard bootlegs. That much of Genesis's live bite was subdued on this album. Even though I enjoy listening to Seconds Out, you can derive more enjoyment listening to bootlegs made from their 1977 tour to really see the different performances and even songs that didn't make the cut on the album. Brand X. During the period shortly following Peter's departure, Phil joined an English jazz fusion band called Brand X and is featured on their first two albums. Unorthodox Behavior, released in 1976, is a wholly instrumental jazz fusion album. Phil would take a lot of these jazz fusion licks that he played on drums and take it back to the band in Genesis. This can mostly be heard on tracks like Robbery, Assault and Battery on Trick of the Tail, and even What Gorilla off Wind and Wuthering. Lamb Tour Pro Shot Footage. Many Genesis fans lament the fact that despite having many television performances and professionally shot footage of the band prior to 1974, the tour for the Lamb is interestingly absent of any video footage of anything. There is one example of a French TV station shooting a black and white clip of the band rehearsing Counting Out Time with no audio. That's it, folks. Being that the Lamb is highly regarded as not only the most prolific and intricate tour setups that they ever made, there is really no effort to capture the performance on video anywhere. Because of this, fans are hopeful that someday there will be a discovery of more footage from the band around this time, in either late 74 or 75. There are only a handful of clips showcasing the band around this time, and most of them are very blurry since they were captured by audience members on very primitive 8mm cameras. For all the lost media nerds out there, consider this a worthy challenge. The waiting room costume. One of the more elusive of Peter Gabriel's stage costumes is the getup that he would put on while performing a deep cut from the Lamb, The Waiting Room. The track itself is probably one of the first examples of mainstream noise rock, as the studio version features the band members improvising noisy and harsh instrumentals for around 3 minutes before clearing into a short jam session. It's an interesting listen on the studio album, and even more interesting during their live shows. Since they used the Lamb Tour to perform the album in its entirety, The Waiting Room was notorious for being off the wall in terms of Genesis performances. Meanwhile, in the back of the stage, behind the projectors, Peter would be wearing a particularly frightening costume consisting of sharp points and long stretchy fingers that he would use to point and grab at the air sporadically. There exists only a few photographs of this costume in action. The Musical Box Cover Band. The Musical Box is a cover band that specializes in recreating Genesis's old shows from the 70s. The members all assume the roles of the old band, and even the lead singer gets dressed up in the same costumes Peter wore in their regular shows. One of the more popular shows to put on is the recreation of the Lamb Lies Down on Broadway tour, and like previously stated, since there's no video archival footage of this actual tour, the recreated version might be one most fans would have to go see in order to experience the album as it was toured back in 1974 and 75. There are countless other Genesis cover bands, some specializing in their 80s output, but Musical Box is probably the most prolific and detailed recreation of any of their shows from the 70s. Even past members such as Peter and Phil have seen their performances and said they were nearly spot on and a good recreation of how they used to perform back in the 70s. Genesis Sessions Home Movie. Phil, being the wannabe videographer that he is, found himself to be in possession of a new video camcorder in around 1983. Taken in their new countryside studio, Phil records a sneak peek into the lives of Genesis as a band, showing off parts of their songwriting and jamming. The video is up for anyone to watch on YouTube and is a must-see for any serious fan of the band. The video is lighthearted and humorous at parts and shows the genuine character of the band and the people who helped make records like this possible. It's an excellent time capsule of life in the mid-80s. There are also some interesting quirks that pop up in the video among the footage. One of these quirks is of particular note, but we'll talk about that a little later. Enosification. Brian Eno of Roxy Music fame and minimalist ambient musician extraordinaire gets a guest writing credit on The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway's liner notes. He is credited for providing something called enosification, which to what degree Brian himself provided this is really uncertain. Most fans claim that many of the vocal effects and weird synth noises that can be found throughout the album are the work of Brian, but no exact credit is given, nor is Brian given any other writing credits on the album. Regardless, the small touches that Brian gave to the album really helped shape its distinctive and unique texture that differs so greatly from other albums that they would make around this time. Roger Taylor 1970 audition. Roger Taylor, who served as the drummer for Queen in the 70s, 80s, and part of the 90s, considered a role for being the new drummer of Genesis in 1970 before landing a gig with Freddie Mercury, John Deacon, and Brian May. He declined to perform with them since he considered their music too progressive. But who knows if Roger's aggressive and powerful playing style would have worked well with the band at the time. Suffice to say, his drumming was better suited for Queen in the grand scheme of things. Another weird audition fact I have is that Elton John, yes, that Elton John, auditioned for King Crimson and Gentle Giant, two other huge progressive rock bands around this time. But he didn't get into either, interestingly enough. Roland the Bisexual Drum Machine.
Yes, you've forgotten about Roland the Bisexual Drum Machine. This is Roland. He's a drum machine. Very economical to run. Bisexual because he doesn't mind who he plays with. Ha! Talk about funny. Ha ha ha! Watch while I send Roland to sleep.
Acting Very Strange. Shortly after recording Abacab, Mike Rutherford released his second and final solo album called Acting Very Strange. The album managed to produce a handful of tunes that slightly made its way to the pop charts. However, fans will usually point out that an absolutely absurd cover that Mike went in with the album. And here it is. Yeah, this is the actual album cover for this record. This was Mike's last solo album, released before getting started with his offshoot band Mike and the Mechanics. On this album, Mike decides to sing all the lead vocals himself, rather than hired another vocalist like on his previous solo album, Small Creep's Day. This is the only time we ever hear lead vocals from Mike on anything. The album itself is pretty average. I have a copy. You can get it at any record store for $1. The Fugitive. Likewise with Tony, he also released a solo album around this time where he decides to provide lead vocals for the work. Probably both of them seeing the success of their drummer, Phil Collins, found on his first solo album around the time, Face Value, which contained the very legendary track In the Air Tonight, among other grocery store playlist favorites. Although I'd say The Fugitive is a really fantastic pop album, especially if you're a fan of Genesis, it didn't really resonate well with the mainstream public. It does have a few songs that could be considered hits, but for the most part it's relatively not well known amongst mainstream audiences. The Lamb Gatefold Text. If you've ever been confused by the story that's being told on their album The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, fans can find a copy of the album on vinyl to help. The inner gatefold on the LP contains a large write-out written by Peter Gabriel himself, highlighting a play-by-play of the story of Rail and is stripped through the seedy New York City underground. It's quite a lengthy read and takes up both sides of the fold-out. And much like the album, the write-up still leaves much to the imagination of the reader and listener, and keeps things very vague and abstract. However, some fans believe there is a deeper subtext that many fans may not be aware of, but more on that a little later. Ray Wilson. Ray Wilson was the replacement for Phil Collins after he briefly departed the band in the mid-90s. Eager to keep playing, remaining members Mike and Tony recruited the talents of Irish singer Ray Wilson, who provided the lead vocals for their final studio album release, Calling All Stations, in 1997. The album itself being a totally divisive album and usually ignored as a serious project from the band. Ray performs well and gives his vocals a very Gabriel-esque tone to them. The music itself, in my opinion, is not terrible and feels more like a solo project from Tony. Considering the vocals and drumming are distinctly not done by Collins, gives this album a weird liminal vibe when compared to the rest of their catalog. It feels alien and unfamiliar in their repertoire music. The LP definitely has its fans, but it also has its fair share of haters. In my opinion, this is a very middle-of-the-road release from the band, but suffers from the fact that Phil is nowhere to be found on this one. Calling All Stations 1998 Live Tour. After completing the studio album, Calling All Stations, the new trio, Tony, Mike, and Ray, along with their new drummer, Nick DiVirgilio, would make their way onto the road for another tour. Starting in Europe, the band was slated to perform in Belgium and the Netherlands before moving on to the UK and America. However, due to very low ratings and popularity, the tour had to be cut short. The band only performed a handful of shows at the time and played a mix of new material from calling all stations as well as older standards from the catalog of music, with Ray providing new textualizations to their older material. Truly some of the rarest Genesis material you can find is the live bootlegs of this recording of the band around this time. Phil Collins whistles melody from Into Deep during Genesis Home Movie. A funny anecdote of the Genesis Home Movie made in 1983 is that during one of the studio run-throughs of Home by the Sea, you can clearly hear Phil whistle a short tune for the camera.
I can imagine how Steven's done this.
Oddly enough, this exact melody would become the basis for the synthesizer break from Into Deep, which was released on Invisible Touch in 1986, 3 years later. Another weird quirk of this is that you can hear Mike play what sounds like the beginning chords of Island in the Sun by Weezer. Peter Gabriel's Squonk demo. Purely fan speculation, but some allege that Peter stuck around to recording some quick demo performances of songs that would come out later on their subsequent project after The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. Although this does not match up with the timeline as we know it, since Peter would have already been long gone before the band returned back to the studio to record songs that would eventually make it on their 1976 album, Trick of the Tail. While it's fun to imagine a demo of Squonk being sung by Peter Gabriel, there actually does exist an AI cover of Squonk that's ran through the Peter Gabriel filter. Sounds really weird because it's Carpet Crawlers 1999. In 1999, the original 5 members of the early 70s lineup got together to do a rendition of their 1974 song, The Carpet Crawlers. Peter Gabriel rejoins the trio of Phil, Mike, and Tony, with Steve Hackett back on guitar in a reimagining of the song. Phil is even able to squeeze in a verse himself. This marks the last time the classic lineup ever performed on a track together. A fitting and pleasant send-off, The Carpet Crawlers 1999 is an amazing rendition of the song, and you should really check it out. And then there were 3 album cover meeting. Popular album art design company Hypnosis helped design the cover for the band's previous album The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, and was commissioned again to create their 1978 album, And Then There Were 3. You probably know them more for the work with Pink Floyd, as they helped create art design for Dark Side of the Moon and Wish You Were Here, to name a couple. The cover for And Then There Were 3 uses a technique of exposing the photograph's film to low light while moving a flashlight around, which can create the illusion of moving lights throughout the photo. Hypnosis was a decidedly experimental company that always sought to push the boundaries of conventional album art. Although the final product looks very confusing, to say the least, there's a story to be told on this cover. However, what you're supposed to do is follow the lights as they mark the places where the main characters of the scene are walking. The car itself is moving onwards, and the 2 figures follow towards the back cover and meander further into the darkness. But without knowing this, the cover makes absolutely zero sense to any regular music listener. Even Hypnosis themselves have come out and said the cover was a failure. Regardless, the strange cover gives this divisive album a unique edge to it. Bank Statement. Bank Statement is an offshoot band created by Tony Banks. Much like Mike and the Mechanics, Tony equipped the talents of Alistair Gordon and Janie Klimek and produced a one-off album called Bank Statement. As a fan, the album isn't great, and isn't even good. Sorry, but this one kinda stinks. Even with guitars provided by Steve Hillage of Gong, the album's not really listenable, unfortunately. I'm not a fan of this, or really of Mike and the Mechanics, but this LP project is especially forgettable. It produced no hits and is merely a blip on any Genesis fan's radar. Strictly Incorporated. Perhaps as a response to poor sales of Bank Statement, Tony Banks then found the talents of Wang Chung frontman Jack Hughes. You know, the guy from Everybody Have Fun Tonight, that song? Yeah, the duo called themselves Strictly Incorporated and managed to produce a few LPs. This project is much better of Tony's prowess as a synth player and a pop star. The duo definitely work better together, and their self-titled album is a very fun listen. This Tony Banks offshoot album definitely deserves a very hearty listen. Up Tempo After the Ordeal. Listening to recordings of the band recording demos for their upcoming album release, Selling England by the Pound, showcases some intricacies of the Genesis songwriting process. Some notable highlights of this include an unused jam that did not make an appearance on any Genesis album and instead found its way to the B-side of Mike Rutherford's solo album Small Creep's Day on Overnight Job that was called Compression. Another quirk is a recording of the band performing the Hackett-based song After the Ordeal in a much faster way than it appears on the album, which makes the song take on a more aggressive feel than the laid-back jam found on the final LP. Phil Collins, Peter Gabriel vocal similarity. A few band members have long pointed out that Peter and Phil share extremely similar vocal texture. Tony has stated in interviews that when Peter and Phil would double up on lead vocals, it would sound like an automatic double-track take. Duke predicted weeaboos. Quite a few Genesis tunes tell a cohesive story over either one single song or a multitude of songs. Going back to the Duke suite from earlier in the video, the story here revolves around the main character of Albert, who is a lonesome homebody who keeps himself occupied by watching TV. Because he's so lonely, he starts to begin to think that the TV is real and the people in it are actual real people who he can interact with. He then begins to fall in love with his TV and the people inside of it. This is the basis for their chart-topping hit, Turn It On Again. Although probably not a popular trope in 1980, the idea of people falling in love with fictional characters to an obsessive degree is more evident in the age of the internet, where people regularly kin fictional characters. In a weird turn of events, Turn It On Again predated weeaboo culture in America by about a few decades or so. Of course, anime has existed in the United States well before the year 1980. We now have more evidence of regular people becoming infatuated with their waifu of choice. Watcher of the Skies 7-inch single mix. On the Foxtrot album, an interesting tidbit about the intro track from their Watcher of the Skies is that the studio LP and live performances always have the same finale and ending. However, when the track was slated to be released as a 7-inch single, much of the song had to be cut down in order to fit the 3-minute runtime, which included deleting the iconic Mellotron introduction for the song and cutting out several other sections of the song to make it more cohesive. But one strange edit was the addition of an alternate ending that is not found on any studio LP or live performance. The single adds one more verse before fading out, and the only way to hear this version is on the 7-inch single itself, which is very rare and hard to come by. There's a version of it on YouTube if you want to really listen to it. Genesis rehearsed Please Don't Touch. During the sessions for Wind and Wuthering, Steve would audition a song for the consideration of the rest of the band called Please Don't Touch, an instrumental composition with a particularly dark edge to it. And because of the democratic basis in which the band operates, the majority of the band members opted not to include the song on the album, rather putting in another more lighthearted instrumental track called Wat Gorilla, a track that ends side A of Wind and Wuthering. Steve usually recalls in interviews that a bulk of material he presents to the band gets nixed in a fashion like this, where songs are democratically chosen to be worked on or discarded. The song eventually made its way onto Steve's second solo album, interestingly called Please Don't Touch, in 1978. Phil and Mike bromance. Phil and Mike definitely had an on-screen romance together. That's really it. The inner sleeve of Invisible Touch proves this is correct. Thanks. That's all. Planned Abacab double LP release and tracklist. In 1981, Genesis would release their 11th studio album LP, Abacab. Upon release, the album received mixed reviews from longtime fans, being that this was the first album where the band fully embraced their recent foray into pop music, foregoing many progressive tendencies that they had on previous albums. The band saw an influx of newer fans of their pop material and greater exposure to radio play, to which the band delighted themselves with larger tours of both America and Europe. The album contains just one disc with a litany of assorted pop songs like No Reply at All, Me and Sarah Jane, and Man on the Corner. Interestingly enough, the album was initially planned to be a double LP, the second double LP in their catalog up to that point, including what would be considered another side-long epic. The songs that would be on this epic include a track that did not make its way onto the final album mix, Dodo Lurker. Dodo is decidedly the most progressive track on the album, and fans have reconstructed what this elusive third side on Abacab would look like, stitching together the tracks Name Name Now, Dodo Lurker, and the instrumental outtake Submarine into one cohesive track. Jackson Tapes, Lamb Connection. In 1970, during live performances at the BBC promoting the Trespass Tour, Genesis would perform several songs that did not make the cut onto the final album. Some of these tracks were studio run-throughs and jam sessions which were dubbed under names like Proclamation or Provocation, probably loosely based on their album track Stagnation. This material would not see any official release and were presumably stored in the audio archives of the BBC. However, fans who listened to these demos noticed the similarities between these Jackson tapes and specific melodies and passages from their 1974 double LP, The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. Parts from Lily White Lilith and Anyway can be traced back to these recordings. However, there may still be more to uncover with these connections, but more on that a little bit later. Exposure, Peter and Phil Reunion. While on hiatus from his previous prog rock band, King Crimson, lead guitarist Robert Fripp kept himself busy in the late 70s creating different projects, some revolving around prog and others revolving around newer rock genres such as punk and new wave. In 1979, Fripp began collaborating with star-studded lineup of classic prog rock musicians and other figures in the music sphere. Some standout musicians include Peter and Collins worked together on a singular album, since Peter left Genesis 5 years prior. The Musical Box actually happened. The story and events in The Musical Box actually happened to Peter Gabriel. It's true. It actually happened. No, I'm sorry, I lied. That'd be kind of funny though. The Light. The first night Phil Collins performed live with Genesis in 1971, the band was testing the waters with a new track that was not featured on any studio LP. The song was named The Light, which stretched to around 6 minutes, but has fan accounts saying it could have been at least 10. It shares eerie similarities to several Genesis songs that would have yet to have been recorded at this time. Like the Jackson tape demos, the song starts off with what would eventually become Lily White Lilith from The Lamb. However, the song departs into different territories and different changes that aren't found on any subsequent Lamb track. The song is extremely rare for fans, and only the absolutely low-quality bootleg is available for fans to listen to on YouTube. The live performance remains elusive, as this may be one of the only handful of times the band ran through this track live before abandoning it to salvage later on other albums. Every copy of Abacab is personalized. You may think this is a joke, and it basically is, but every copy of Abacab is, quite honestly, personalized. The cover on your copy of the album might be different than your friend's copy of the album. What? It's true. Well, in reality, the abstract cover shares the same design, but has 4 different variants of the color that are available. Quite interestingly at the time, perhaps taking a cue from Led Zeppelin on their 1979 album In Through the Outdoor, which featured 6 different cover itinerations that can be purchased. And even better yet, with that album, every copy came in its own plastic bag, obscuring the cover so you wouldn't know which variant you got. Pretty interesting stuff. Whodunit Negative Emotional Aura. Much like the Wet Dry World Negative Emotional Aura of Super Mario 64 fame, there is a certain effect the song Whodunit has on listeners who put on Abacab for the first time. Either fans are in on the joke and can find the humor in the song, or absolutely loathe the song and skip it entirely without any remorse. The song is the band's take on punk rock, somehow, with a repetitive drum beat and obnoxious synth lines and a vocal delivery meant more for a macaw parrot. The song Whodunit regularly tops fans' worst Genesis songs lists, along with tracks from Calling All Stations and From Genesis to Revelation. Every Phil Collins video is about making music videos. Just a weird observation about a few music videos with Phil Collins is that they all seem to revolve around the act of making a music video. The video for Easy Lover and Invisible Touch have this odd behind-the-scenes feel to them. Even the video for Billy Don't Lose My Number is a music video about other music videos parroting the popular videos shown at MTV around the time. It's just a weird observation. I don't know if it means anything significant or whatever. The Lamb movie adaptation, Jodorowsky. Interesting tidbit was that Peter Gabriel was initially approached by famous art house director Jodorowsky in creating a film adaptation of The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. Talks were in with Peter Gabriel around the time around creating this film adaptation, but never really went anywhere, probably because he was too busy directing other movies around the time. George Harrison appears on Acting Very Strange. Although there's no evidence to back this up, George Harrison allegedly appears as a guest musician on the last track of Acting Very Strange, Mike's second solo album. This is featured on the track Hideaway. Admittedly, the guitar solo sounds strikingly similar to George Harrison's trademark slide guitar solos he popularized in his time with the Beatles and his very stellar solo projects from the 1970s. Whether it's Mike doing a decent George impression or the man himself, Hideaway does take my pick for the best track off an otherwise odd album to listen to. Les Ironic Meme. Alright, so this entry is only going to make sense between me and a few other people I talked to on Discord years ago, but back in 2017 there was a YouTube video called Les Ironic Meme, which featured the text Les Ironic Meme, created very sloppily on MS Paint with a heavily pixelated image of Tony Banks next to it. The video itself is just that picture with audio of a synthesizer doing an out-of-tune arpeggio with the loud porn man screaming in the background, and this went on for like 5 minutes. I don't know, but if anyone knows anything about this or has a copy of it since it's been deleted from YouTube, please let me know or comment down below because I just want to know I'm not going crazy or anything. Bill Bruford, Phil Collins drum duet on Mario 64 title screen. A little known fact about the sound design of Mario 64 is that Bill Bruford and Phil Collins performed the drum duet solo on the title screen. Just kidding. Phil Collins' Alamo connection. For years, Phil Collins has been a huge proponent and enthusiast for the Alamo, the historic landmark located in San Antonio, Texas, even assisting with the funding for the building by donating several $1,000s in an effort to preserve the building for future generations. It seems Phil's proclivity towards Wild West paraphernalia such as that has always intrigued him, even since the 70s. A few songs from And Then There Were Three have to do with being out in the Wild West, and to me this just makes a lot of sense. I think the dude just really likes westerns. Lamb's birth metaphor. Alright, here's another weird one. I mean, we're at the bottom of the iceberg, they're all going to be weird, but I remember back a few years ago, there was a really weird website done in old style HTML formatting like it was in the 90s that outlined basically this one fan's theory of The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway being an entirely huge metaphor for giving birth, which admittedly is a weird topic to talk about, but since Peter Gabriel was the main lyricist behind the album itself and was dealing with a pregnancy from his wife at the time, eventually leading to him leaving the band, it actually kind of makes sense if you really think about it. Just reading about his ideas, and even with the lyrical content that's in the Carpet Crawlers, you gotta get in to get out, kind of makes sense in the grand scheme of things. But I can provide a link for you down below in the box too if you really want to read this. It's kind of a trip. You do have to be familiar with the lyrics of The Lamb before you get into it, but if you really want to blow your mind, here you go. Everything is Genesis. Everything is Genesis. Have you ever seen three dudes standing together? Everything is Genesis. Connections. Stay with me for a moment. Think about it. The band Genesis, usually you think of 3 or 5 guys in their mid-20s who all have very particular qualities to their appearance. With our brains being fine-tuned for pattern recognition, sometimes it's easy to start seeing things. Take any 3 dudes standing together. The tall one. There's connections. The serious one. The short one. The tall one. I'm not going crazy, you are. And that's it. That's the end of the Genesis Iceberg. If you were able to stick it out this long, thank you so much. I really do appreciate it. I believe this video is now at about an hour long, but if you're still here to the end, I really do appreciate it. I haven't told you yet, but if you're a fan of this content and content like this, I would go ahead and smash that subscribe button, ring the bell, leave a comment if you love Genesis. Maybe we can have some discussion going on. What's your favorite song? Who knows? Well, hope you enjoyed. Subscribe for more content like this. I should be putting out a few more things as we go along throughout the year. Thank you. Ciao.